Hello, and welcome to this episode of Catching the Octopus podcast. So, today I wanted to talk about something that the title may create a little bit of angst or controversy, but stick around because I'm going to tell it in a really logical way. So, I wanted to talk about witchcraft. Now, witchcraft is something that we all do every day. And it's really just been framed as something that is evil or something that is dark or something that is to be avoided, right? But historically, what we now call witchcraft often included many things such as herbal medicine. Midwifery was also looked at as witchcraft in those early days. Any spiritual or emotional guidance or intuitive and experiential knowledge, right? So those elements were often held by individuals, which were particularly women, that fell outside of formal systems. So as society started becoming more structuralized and falling into more of a patriarchy, there were systems that were set up, and those elements that we now call witchcraft fell outside of that. And they began to label them and the practices that were happening as dangerous or as evil because they wanted to reduce the influence they had on the community around them. And they also wanted to get people to focus more on those centralized authority spaces and the institutions that were being built, like, you know, with medicine, for instance. They had started institutionalizing, if I can speak, the whole practice of medicine. So the women that would practice midwifery or would practice herbal medicines and things like that were shunned and ostracized and called witches because they wanted to disintegrate those practices. And so they created fear around those independent people that were embodying knowledge that fell outside of the systems that they wanted to create. So from a cognitive psychology perspective, humans are wired to avoid uncertainty. We like what is familiar. We're wired to fall into patterns that are familiar. We're wired to trust things that are familiar. And so anything we can't explain often gets labeled as a threat or often gets set up for something to be feared. And that's why I wanted to talk about this, right? Because witchcraft, the word itself, has a lot of stigma attached to it that has been set up so that we avoid it, so that we label it as a threat or something to be feared because we haven't been able to explain it. So any practices that involve using your intuition or using energy or any kind of symbolism, they're often characterized as things that are dark or unsafe or things that we shouldn't really be trusted. And that's because that aligns with that threat bias, right? That pattern seeking behavior of looking at someone and judging and going, oh, they don't fit in the mold, so we need to fear them. Or the practices that they're doing aren't familiar to us, so we need to fear them. And this is where I have shifted in my whole approach to life, because if something comes at me that I don't understand, I now get curious. And this is why I talk about curiosity a lot. Becoming curious about something, learning more about it. One, it gives you more knowledge, opens up your understanding. And also, it takes away that fear-based threat of things that we don't understand. And you may even be really, you know, interested to see or surprised that when we research things and we look in, they can even change our perspective or our belief systems. And from a structural perspective, an institutionalized perspective, we're not encouraged to change our perspective or our belief systems because then that doesn't fit within the structure that's been created for us. So many practices from that stem from witchcraft activities, they weren't actually made to disappear. They were kind of just relabeled. And so ritual shifted from something being magic to something being more religion in a religious practice. Spell work then became something we call prayer, ritual cleansing, sacrament. So if we look at just religious context, so I was raised as a Catholic. I was baptized, had a first Holy Communion. I went to church regularly, went through private schools for my primary school schooling, and a lot of those aspects I now see in the day to day, right? And the theories behind why they did them and where their power comes from. And so it's just shifted from one to the other. But the structure, that kind of remains the same. As I said, I can see the meaning behind things. There's still the same intention. There's still a lot of symbolism. There's repetition. There's emotional engagement, getting people to feel a particular way, because when we're emotionally engaged, that influences the way our belief systems are created. People won't remember always what you do for them, but they will remember how you made them feel. And so emotion is a big motivator behind behavior. And so then for these institutions to create what they've created, they're still conditioning us now. So back in the day, it was burning witches, right? So they went on a witch hunt. So that then created fear, not only to practice it, but also to know someone who was practicing it. So people would dob in their neighbor just so that they weren't the one that was going to be burnt alive. Men got burnt alive as well. It wasn't just women, predominantly though it was women, right? So anyone that didn't fit in the structure, labeled a witch, let's burn them, because they needed to take the power away from those elements. And then even in childhood, as we're growing up and adulthood as well, we're showing different things that culturally condition us to see magic and witches in a particular way. So if you have a think about witches in any of the Disney movies that you see or any of the other movies you see, they're usually ugly, they're evil, they're isolated, no one wants to be their friend, they don't have companions, warts on their nose, all of those sorts of things. And we're also conditioned that magic is dangerous. Things go wrong, things explode, all of that. So that creates a schema in our brain that witch is bad, witchcraft is bad. And so what a schema is that's something that's set up in our brain that will automatically create a story or an association, because our brain also likes shortcuts, right? If we were looking to go and hire a tradesperson for our house, tend to these days go on Google reviews and have a look and see if they've got good Google reviews. That creates us a belief system that they're going to do a good job. Now, being in this kind of business, I've had people offer me for me to pay them for them to get a whole heap of Google reviews for me, which I declined. But so that can happen. So when you're looking at a Google review, doesn't always mean that it's real, right? The best way to do that is speak to someone who's actually engaged their services to know. But our brain wants to create shortcuts. So it creates these schemas. And then that creates some automatic process. So it's really important as well to how biases are formed and how they operate in our mind as well, because we're creating this pathway in our brain that can offset all of the multiple steps of using logic and understanding and investigation and getting all of those other elements in to just go, oh, if this happens, then generally this is going to be the outcome. And so we have that shortcut that our brain can get. So let's look a little bit at what witchcraft traditionally involves, right? So it involves things like intention setting. There's also symbolic action that comes into witchcraft. There can be using of the elements, so fire, water, earth, air, all of those sorts of things. They can bring those in. There's a lot of repetition as well in witchcraft. If you've seen some of the movies, you'll hear when they do an incantation or a spell, they're just repeating over and over and over certain phrases. And there's also emotional engagement. So there's feeling the thing that you need or want to happen, what you're trying to create. So this, if you look at that psychologically as well, there's a psychological aspect that connects with that. And from that perspective, all of those things are overlapping with priming. So when we look at intention setting, we're actually priming ourselves to be able to go into a particular situation or look for things that are similar to that. There's also conditioning. There's the placebo effect. There's behavioral anchoring, identity reinforcement. One of the things that, although I don't practice in a lot of the things you would call witchcraft, I do a lot of things that still fall into this element. So I have, photos of when there was a really good time, or I was with some great people, or I had really great emotions. And when I look at those, I feel those emotions again. That's that kind of anchoring element. And there's also identity reinforcement as well. So instead of magic, we could just maybe call it, the intentional influence of internal state using ritual and meaning, because that's what we're doing. So changing that terminology then makes it more palatable and takes out the stigma that's associated with it. And as I said before, there's rituals that we do every day that link to witchcraft. And so I wanted to share that as well, to try and take some of the stigma away from those words. And also, once we go through all of these things, you may actually find and go, I actually am going to start this particular ritual. I'm going to take a piece of that and a piece of that and a piece of that, and I'm going to do this now because this is going to create better well-being for me, or better manifestation, or a better element of perception in my mind, or adjust my belief systems, whatever it may be. So the first one that I think is pretty common, I don't know if there's anyone that I know that hasn't done this, and maybe you might say, yes, I haven't, so you might be the exception to the rule, but it's birthday candles and wishes, right? So when we're doing this ritual, we light candles on the birthday cake. So there's that fire element of transformation. At that point, we pause and we focus on a desire, which we call a wish, right? So what do we desire? Something to change, something to happen, manifesting an element or a material element to come into our lives. And at that point, we attach emotion to it, which is hope. We actually have hope that this is going to happen. Or we maybe, when we're thinking about that item that we're trying to focus on, that desirable item, we could feel some excitement, happiness, those sorts of things aligned with that. And then you blow out the candles. Then you release the intention. So you blow that out and release that intention into the environment, right? And so this kind of mirrors candle magic. So if anyone else does any candle magic, you'll now see the alignment and go, yeah, you may have already seen the alignment. You go, oh yeah, that actually connects, right? Because the fire is used to amplify the intention, and then you breathe out to release it. And so some people use candle magic within their manifestation rituals and techniques. So they'll light a candle, they'll set the intention on what they want to happen, how they want that to be, and then they blow it out. Some people use candle magic for setting ambience in a room, or for setting different aromas. So for setting that mental space of like, my house feels calm because I'm smelling this, or I feel calm when a candle's burning. Or some people use candle magic as well for remembering people that have passed. I know that when I used to go to church, there was an area that you could light a candle in memory of one of your loved ones that have passed. And so they were burnt to show recognition and acknowledgement, and, the love that you have for that person. At one point, that would be, blown out, excuse me, or put out. And then that was the intention that was setting there. So psychologically, what that whole process does is it sets up goal priming. So it sets you up for setting a goal, and then emotionally encoding that goal. And then over time, your behaviors may realign to actually fit that goal. So for me, I remember one of my birthday wishes was for a fur coat. I wanted a fur coat. It was very little. And I remember a couple of birthdays I did it. And then at a birthday I was having, I went to blow my candles out and I realized I had a fur coat. Now, that fur coat had been a hand-me-down from a family friend, I believe. But I didn't recognize it had come into my possession until I went to wish for it again. And so it works, right? When you manifest, you set the intention, and the behavioral alignment over time aligns with that. So, when I was gifted those clothes, there would have been some things I would have said, no, don't want that, that doesn't fit, but that did. And so I was aligned to accepting that. And so there's a psychological aspect to all of this as well. And if you know me, you know how I like matching the psychology and the spiritual elements, because the spiritual elements just don't have the research behind them to prove the scientific element, but they are science, right? And we're starting to get there a little bit when we're talking about quantum physics and all of those elements. We're starting to look at and do more research on these things. We even had some of our forces, our military aspects, actually were working at remote viewing and communication, telepathic communication. And so it's recognized. It's just that they don't recognize it publicly, right? Because it doesn't fit into that structure of those systems. So I am going to talk a little bit about things that have more of a Catholic background purely because that's where my knowledge sits. But one of the other ones is baptism, right? So when you look at baptism, baptism is a witchcraft ritual that's been rephrased, reprogrammed. It uses water. So the water is usually used to symbolize that cleansing and that rebirth. So it uses one of the elements. At the same time, there's an incantation, or rather words spoken over the individual that then creates an identity shift, right? A before and an after. So you're, reborn, you're purified, you become part of the family. So it creates that identity shift in that space. So this kind of mirrors the ritual cleansing practices that you may do. So the water acts as the purification and the words are the intention or the invocation of what you're trying to get. And so with cleansing practices, there's so many you can do. I do them at the end of each year. I actually go down to the beach. I use the water and also the component of salt, which we'll talk about in a moment. And I stand in that and I actually do a full energy cleanse and cleanse that into the water, right? And for me, that's getting rid of any of the old energy that's been stuck from the year previously, any of the challenges that were there, any of the blocks that are holding me back, any of the belief systems no longer serving me. And so I cleanse them out and get rid of them. And then on the first day of the year, then I set intentions for what I want for the rest of the year. So it's similar in a way. It doesn't have the religious context around it, but it's got the same premise. And so when we look at that psychologically, that's giving us identity anchoring. When I was introduced to the church, I was a little bit older. So I think I was about year 3 when I had my baptism. So I ended up going to a public school for half of my year 1. And then I went into private school. And so when I went into private school, everyone around me had been baptized and I hadn't. And I felt like I didn't fit in. I wasn't a part of that. And so after I had my baptism, then I had that identity anchoring. I was actually part of that community. It also had the social reinforcement. I was accepted in. I was one of them. I was, doing what God had kind of outlisted for in that religion for the steps for me to take to be able to have that closeness with him. And there's also that emotional imprinting as well when it comes to that. And then if I continue on in that space, for me, we had the communion, first Holy Communion, right? And so once you have your first Holy Communion in the Catholic faith, then at Mass, you can actually go and receive the Eucharist, right, from the priest or one of the representatives that are up the front. And what that is, it's a little wafer. If you haven't done it before, it's just a little bit of I suppose a wafer is the closest thing that I can do to. But the aspect behind that is it's symbolizing the bread and wine are symbolizing the body and blood, right? So they call it bread, and in some rituals, I'm sure they do use bread, but from what I received, it was like a little wafer, but that symbolized the body. And then when they drank the wine, which is usually the priest and the representatives will drink the wine, that represented the blood. And so the idea of that was consuming that helped you become aligned with the meaning. It helped you keep closeness because that was the body and blood of Jesus. So that aligned with the closeness of becoming closer to God and increasing that connection you had. And so this ritual was around ingestion and invocation. So taking something symbolic into the body. And so then when you do that, you can embody its qualities, right? So by having the body and blood of Jesus, that then made me more Jesus-like in that ritual. And so from a psychological perspective, that created a deep belief reinforcement, right? That yes, these my beliefs here I'm actually doing consistently, aligning myself with that, and that helped condition my identity. And then the repetition is something that strengthens neural pathways. So even in life, if you are starting a new sport, my daughter's just starting netball, repeating those drills at netball training, shooting for goal, doing the passing, looking at how to get out from behind a player, sticking to a player in defense, repeating that also, that then strengthens those neural pathways. And that's a part of that ritual in the way that that does. Now, moving away from the religious aspect, I want to go into something that's probably a little bit more commonly done, and that's things around herbal remedies and cleansing elements. So that's looking at teas and oils and plant-based remedies. And these used to be the things that we would look at for a medical intervention before they brought in the structures. Now, disclosure, I am a fan of Western medicine. If it wasn't for Western medicine, neither of my children would be alive today. So it does have a time and a place. However, I've been healed a lot of with my issues that I've had, physical issues, have been healed through more of the Eastern medical practices, through things like, energy healing and plant-based healing and those aspects. And so when we can join these things together, then we can get the maximum benefits. So it might be around having teas or putting oils on our body. With our skin's our biggest organ, but things are ingested, I don't know if that's the right word, by the skin into the body. And science is catching up with that, right? Like I'm, going through my perimenopause, and I was lucky enough to get some estrogel, and that is applied on the skin. So that goes into my body through the skin. There's other different oils and things and creams that I use. Magnesium, I get that into my body through the skin. You can also burn herbs or diffuse different scents. So I know I was able to come across some frankincense, which is amazing at reducing cognitive pressure, right? So it creates a calmness in the mind. And as soon as I start burning that, if I breathe that in, I can feel all of my mind just calm. And at the time, I was living with someone who was quite highly strung and suffered a little bit from some mental health challenges and those sorts of things. And so if they tended to be in an emotional state that was a little bit irregulated, I would put on my oils and I would burn frankincense, and it would create a calming space. So, a lot of people use doTERRA or naturopathy or things like that. And we're starting to allow that back into our lives now and realizing how much positive aspect that has. But in the early days, when they were just setting up these institutions around the medical profession, this was all classified as witchcraft. People were burned for using oils and herbs and things like that. So this ritual, though, mirrors the traditional plant-based magic and plant-based magic and healing. Herbs are assigned different properties, whether they're calming, protective, energizing, all those sorts of things. And then we bring them into our systems. So it's real and it's grounded because many herbs do have biochemical effects, and we've been able to now prove that through science. And smell even directly influences the nervous system, whether we realize it or not. You might have, a loved one that had a particular scent that they would wear. And if you smell that scent, you're instantly taken back to memories of them. So smell has a really big connection with the nervous system. So this ritual has both physiological and symbolic healing in there, and also that psychological element as well when we're doing that. Now, I mentioned salt earlier on, and I wanted to talk a little bit about salt rituals. So one salt ritual that many people do is throwing salt. So if they spill salt when they're cooking, they get a little bit and they throw it over their left shoulder, right? And it's a bit of a superstition that's come from magic rituals, right? Or the basis behind those. Salt traditionally is used for protection and purification. and it mirrors more of that protective ritual using the natural elements. Right. So I use salt in a few different ways. So as I mentioned before, I go down to the ocean for the salt water. Anyone that does feel unwell or having challenges will find if they go down to the ocean, whether they go in it or not, just inhaling the salt has a real healing effect for people. I've also, from my knowledge with energy healing, I actually use a little bowl of salt water that I put underneath my client's chair. So any energies that come from them during their sessions, whether it's hypnotherapy, past life sessions, or the energy healing sessions, I intentionally direct that into the salt water, and that collects all of those energies. So salt is a disintegrator of negative energy. So energy, when we're talking about that, energy you can't destroy energy, but you can transform energy and you can change the structure of energy. Now, this is scientifically proven as well when you look at the science behind when they look at how energy works. So, and that's like even electrical energy, those sorts of things, energy creates heat. When I'm healing, I actually get heat, right, from the energy that I'm using. So salt can be used for that. I actually have created little sprays as well that I give to my clients. And sometimes when I'm in amongst it all, I will spray, I put lavender in mine as well, because lavender has, being purple is a disintegrator of negative energy, a protection. And so if we go back into a religious context, I'm jumping here, but bear with me. When you go for confession, the priest is usually wearing a purple shawl or a sash. That's what I'm looking for. A purple sash around their neck. And that is for protecting them from the negative energy that comes from people going blah and spewing out all their sins, right? So, and lavender also has a lot of biochemical healing properties. So it's a pain relief, it's a relaxer, it's all those sorts of things. So I have little sprays, this is what I was trying to get at, and I will spray that above my head and stand under and inhale that just to clear out any of the energy that might be sitting on me in the moment. I also, when I clean my house, once I've cleaned my house, I will go around to all the rooms and I will spray it with salt water and lavender. So that's one of the witchy practices that I'm involved in myself. And that just disintegrates any of the energies that sit in heavy spaces. When I first learnt about how salt worked, when I first started learning about energy healing, I remember my daughter having a really tough time going to sleep this one night, and she would have been maybe about 7 at the time and maybe 8. And she was like, Mum, I can't get to sleep. And even my husband at the time was there when this happened. And she said, do you mind just doing some of your salt? And I'm like, sure, I can do that. So at that point, I didn't have sprays. I just had like a bowl that I would put salt water in. And I went in and I flicked it around her room. And after I flicked it around her room, I felt like this breeze is the best way to say it, like a gentle breeze come past me. And I thought, oh, that's weird. Maybe I'm imagining it, right? Because even though I do energy healing, sometimes I question myself because I have such a logical brain. And she just looked at me. She goes, did you feel that? And I went, wow, you did feel it too? She's like, yeah, I did. And so it actually cleansed out the room. Now, as I said at the time, my husband would get into a lot of worry thoughts. So I would flick over where he sat on the couch. I would flick over in our bedroom as well. And, this one time I was sitting on his seat on the couch and I started worrying. And this is when I started recognizing what were my thoughts and what weren't, what was coming from other people from an energetic perspective. And I sat there and went, these aren't my thoughts. So I pulled out the salt water and I flicked it all around, and it cleared the energy in that space and I could sit there without having them. And even though my husband wasn't a big believer in all of these things that I did, there was a couple of times where he actually asked for a salt cleanse as well, a salt flick cleanse. So it was felt in our house. And because it was felt, then we actually continued that practice. So from a psychological perspective, the salt reduces anxiety. Even if it's from a placebo effect, even if you don't feel the energy, it can create that perceived safety for people. And so that can be helpful as well. I have also had a friend of mine that had neighbors that were a bit unruly and that were dysregulated emotionally. They sold drugs, those sorts of things. And so I said to her, might sound a bit weird, but just trust me, go and put a ring of salt around your house. And so a ring of salt has that protection element of your house. And you'll see in movies and things like that where they do witchy things in movies, they'll often make patterns and things out of salt. So that's where the salt rituals kind of connect. So I mentioned a little bit, I think I quickly mentioned prayer before. So I wanted to come into that. So prayer is a form of witchcraft, right? Because we're doing incantations. There's usually a lot of repetition. There's a lot of emotional focus and directed intention. So it aligns with spell work or invocation. And those words that we use are usually used to influence the internal and external experience that we have. And if you look at things like the Lord's Prayer, so if you don't know the Lord's Prayer, it's the one that starts off with Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, etc., etc. So that prayer existed before Christianity existed. It actually existed before Jesus was even born. And I imagine Jesus found that prayer and recognized the connection that it had with the energetic spaces. Like I'll can give you another podcast episode on what I think Jesus aligned with, but this one's just focused on the witchcraft, right? So that prayer, if you go back through history, I think it might have been created by the Egyptians. Don't quote me on that. Do your own research, find out more about it. But each of the lines in the Lord's Prayer actually attach to one of our energy centers. So, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, looking at the crown, looking at the Ajna chakra. They will be done, looks at the Ajna chakra. That's our will center of getting stuff done from a higher perspective. And then it goes through as well, serving other people, looking at our solar plexus, etc. And so every line of that attaches. And so the whole concept of the Lord's Prayer is to open us up on an energy perspective. And it's actually very cleansing as well. So prayer has energy connections, it has spell work connections, and it also has ritual connections that form within the church. Another really good prayer that you can get into if you like prayer is the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, which talks about, Lord, let me be an instrument of your peace. Which is saying, hey, I want to now be a vessel and I want to serve other people using that pure energy that comes from the pure source. Right? And so, where there is sadness, let me bring joy, etc., etc. You can do your own research on that prayer. So every morning when I do my meditation, I actually do that prayer with my hands out and I send that energy out to the world, and then I sit in my silence. So I actually use prayer as part of my meditation, which some people do. So psychologically, when we look at prayer, we're looking at emotional regulation. It's a really good tool for getting us to be calm. From an energy perspective, usually in prayer, we're actually sharing our problem or our gratitude or our issues with something higher than us, which can actually then help dispel that from our bodies. It helps with the emotional regulation, cognitive reframing as well, and it's hope and resilience building. And resilience building is very helpful when we're just tackling everyday, day-to-day things. I talked a little bit about meditation, but meditation and visualization, they're elements of witchcraft, right? They're directing thoughts and directing imagery, and they mirror that mental magic, the inner alchemy that we have. But also from a psychological perspective, it showcases neuroplasticity. You're rewiring your brain pathways when we're doing things like visualization. When I first did my hypnotherapy program, I actually came across a study that was done. It was by archers. And so there was this group that were practicing archery, and they actually had 3 sections of the study. They had people that had no intervention at all, that would just go. They had another group that would practice their archery. They had another group that would have hypnotherapy. And when they looked at the results, the ones that had hypnotherapy, visualization hypnotherapy, so the ones that were visualizing hitting the bullseye every time, at the end, when they tested, they had the better results even from the ones who had practiced, because it set up the neuroplasticity. They knew exactly where they were looking. Their body was set up in the exact position, and then they were able to replicate that in real life as well. Meditation and visualization also influences subconscious programming, which can be helpful. It helps with regulation, and it also helps with the goal setting intention as well with that. So there's many other elements that you can go into. One more. I'll look at weddings, right? Weddings is a form of witchcraft, and most people, if you haven't been married, have been to a wedding, right? So there's vows. So there's incantations that people share, promises, sort of like that prayer element of looking at sharing the incantation of what they are setting up for the future. So they're setting the intention there. There's rings, there's symbolization of infinity. A ring has no start, no end, which is a representation of the relationship of a marriage, right? There's witnesses to that. So there's people that actually witness the element of marriage as well, which is reinforcing. And so this mirrors a bit of a binding ritual. At my wedding, I had a candle lighting ceremony. So we had, my husband and I both had things. We went and lit a candle together, showing that we're actually starting and creating something together. There's other weddings that I've seen that have a physical binding ritual where they actually bind the hands together with ribbon. So there's those witchcraft elements that come into everyday practices like weddings as well. Now, from a psychological perspective, those rituals help with the identity transformation, help of becoming, oh, now we're one. We move forward now together as in a oneness. There's also social reinforcement, because that's kind of an expectation. It's getting not as necessary these days, but at some point in time, it was an expectation that people would get married. There was a social reinforcement for that. And then there's also things like, pre-performance rituals, people wanting to wear their lucky socks. They've got intentions set on their socks. People having lucky charms, like having amulets and things like that they need to have on them when they go to do something in particular. There's other rituals where you'll see some tennis players. I think it was, I can't remember his name. Anyway, but before he serves, he does like an ear flick, puts his hair, rubs his thing, and then he serves the ball. So he has like a pattern that he does. For me, I have rituals in the morning. My whole morning is set up in the morning with rituals that then set me for activation. And so, yeah, they mirror that ritual for state activation. They get you into a point where your emotions, thoughts, and behaviors are aligned in a particular way for what you need to achieve. And so when we look at this, if we can take out the stigma on the words, when I say the word witchcraft, I wonder if that's still triggering you, right? But if we say the word ritual, does that trigger you? And if I say the word intention, does that trigger you? So intention is probably going to be the less activating word in people, because that has the less stigma attached to it. But really, it's just belief influences over our internal state, right? And not all when we're looking at those things, we also need to acknowledge that not all intention is neutral. Now, I said before I'm not really big on the witchy, but now that I've done this episode, I think I pretty much am. I do have a lot of rituals in my life. I do have the salt water. I send, if there's someone does something to actually trigger or upset me, or if I see someone in pain, I send them loving, healing energy. I do things in my meditation. I don't do formal prayer, but in the prayer that I do, I wish them all the best. I had a friend of mine that was working with a colleague, and this colleague was terrible. And I had one as well, and we were talking about it. And I was talking to her about what I was setting the intention for this colleague of mine. Now, at first I was like, I just hope they get the sack, right? And they leave. But then I changed that, because I looked at that and I went, hang on, that intention has something bad happening to them. And when you start working with the universal energy, you actually realize that what you put out into the world is what is sent back to you, but amplified. So you don't want to put out anything negative to people. And so I ended up changing that up, and I started trying to manifest and hope that he would actually be offered a better opportunity, a job that had more money or had more alignment or had more flexibility. And so that would get him out of my space, but it actually benefited him as well. And so I said that to her, you need to try and set this up. And it worked. This person, they still had to work with them, but they were moved to a different office, which was better for them. They actually enjoyed that office better. They enjoyed the people they were working with because they had more contact with senior management. Excuse me. And that friend of mine got to work in a more peaceful environment, right? So well, we're looking at when we're doing anything that's witchy, ritual, intention, anything in that element, is we need to make sure that when we're setting it up, we're setting things up for the benefit of other people. Now, I do see a fair bit of stuff that's on the darker side that maybe people don't realize they shouldn't be doing, or they don't really fully think about doing. So I see sometimes on social media, putting someone's name or photo in the freezer to freeze them out. Or another one I saw was placing a photo in your shoe, right? And so then you're stepping on them, or you're diminishing their power that they have over you. Now, they work, right? You set the energy intention, you do all those things, it will work. And they do it because they frame that as being protective, or setting boundaries, or, removing someone from your life. But underneath, you can see where I'm going with this, right? They actually involved directing negative intention toward the other person. That never ends well. Right. So be very careful if you're setting up and coming into this space, even with manifesting, when you're trying to manifest things for yourself. Also add in manifesting things for other people, because when you're manifesting greatness for other people, then you're putting that out into that universal space. Like I said, it comes back to you amplified. And so I try and manifest positive things for people that actually do me harm and do me wrong, because when I'm doing that, one, I'm not clogging out my energy centers with hate and sadness and frustration, or anger and resentment and harm towards them. I'm having clarity and clearness. And two, then I'm projecting out great things to them. I know great things come back to me. Now, some people might be like, oh, but that's not the right intention, because you're only blessing them so that you get blessings. It's still blessing them. The intention is not to cause them harm. And that's what they're looking at. And if you do have any connection with religion, one of the things that I'm really grateful to take out of my religious journey, or the journey in religion that I had, is one of Jesus's teaching of do unto others on what you would like done unto you. Now, that just has been used as a moral aspect, but that's got a lot of energy fact behind it. Right? So that's how energy works. Do unto others what you would like done back unto you. And that's exactly how the energy world works. So be careful how you're framing things. And if your intention is based around anger, resentment, or harm, then you're actually not only setting that up energetically, but you're strengthening those emotional pathways within yourself as well, which is not going to be helpful for you in the long run. And when you focus on someone else negatively, then your attention, it filters and looks for more evidence of that. So you're not setting yourself up for that, for success in that space. Your behaviors shift, your interactions change with that person. You would know if you meet someone that doesn't particularly like you, you can feel their energy's uneasy or uncertain, or that it's not trustworthy. Whereas so that's how you're projecting to them as well, right? But if you can remove all of that and just project love and great things for them, when you come into contact with them, that's how your energy is set up. And it's a lot easier to interact with them. Unfortunately, at this point during the editing process, I realized that the audio cuts out. So thank you, Tech Issues, for doing that. Now, there are only a couple of minutes left anyway on the episode, so I'd covered all the content that I was hoping to cover, and I just wanted to do this voiceover and thank you for listening to this episode, and also let you know that I look forward to serving you again in our next episode.